Okay, so firstly, let me welcome, we've got Marguerite Evans-Galea, who is the Executive Director, Industry Mentoring Network in STEM. Welcome, Marguerite. Meaghan FitzPatrick, who is a research scientist at CSL and a former APR.Intern. Welcome. Karen Lamb, who's a superstar of STEM, Science and Technology Australia. Robert Munn, who's the Executive Director for Engineering and Information Sciences at the Australian Academy of Science. And Alesha Printz, who's President of the Victorian Division of Engineering Australia and our host of our location today. So fantastic. Welcome all of you, and I'm really interested to hear what the next session is going to hold. So Jeff gave me a challenge as I had my 2-minute break and tried to look after children at the same time, so there you go, that's working as a woman. So a couple of challenges that I think came out of the last session. Some are the oldies and the new oldies that really I think were around when I was an undergrad. It was a long time ago, just in case, and I'm still trying to get over the fact that, Melissa, you're 40. That's not true. If only we could all look that good. So the old challenges I really think are, how do you maintain your career after you've had a career break? And certainly a lot of my cohort when I was going through a PhD are no longer in academia or even in industry. They are beautiful stay-at-home mothers, but I think what a waste to the economy that has been. Not that they're not doing wonderful things with their children. How do we stop that scissor effect from occurring so that our next generation of particularly females think it's just an implement to cut things and not actually a paradigm where females cross over and don't reach that glass ceiling? And I think what's really interesting is, how do we make females more resilient, more risk-taking, or even should we? Is that something that we want, or do we empower a different generation to look at things differently? I'll put it out there, I'm waiting for the answers. But I'm going to start with a new one, because I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience that'll bear those out. But the one that really interests me a lot is one of the new challenges, and that really is who bears the burden of change. Is it the females that need to take on that mantra and continue to do it ourselves, or is there a system change that we need to have? And I see Marguerite smiling at me from the end, so I'm going to go straight to you.
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, so thanks for the invite, and great to be having this conversation. We weren't having these conversations 5 years ago, so I think that's an incredibly exciting pace and momentum that's happened in Australia. And with respect to who bears the burden, it's everybody. We all bear the burden, men, women, everybody. Nobody gets away with not enforcing change, instilling change, encouraging change, and enacting change.
Beautiful. I've lost my place there, and this is what happens when you just think you've done it so well the first session. Karen, as a I was living the dream. I'm looking at the wine at the end of that session. Karen is a superstar of STEM. I'm interested because you are out there promoting. What's your thoughts on where that burden lies?
I have to agree with what you're saying. I guess one of the reasons I applied for the Superstars of STEM program was the sheer frustration I had about the differences in expectations on men and women's employment in my field. So I'm a biostatistician, I'm an applied biostatistician, so my role involves helping people with statistics, talking to lots of people, teaching, as well as doing research. That's an important part of my job. But what I found in prior roles I've had is that the men were able to have the time to do the research, whereas the women were given a lot of the teaching and the administration. And now, while I enjoy that role, certainly what was helping you get ahead was getting the research out there. And that certainly seemed to be what was needed in the research environment. But what I reflected on in joining the Superstars of STEM program was, while I was frustrated about that, I wasn't really saying that enough. And that was a huge problem because, I would tell my friends, I'd tell my peer group, and I'd say that this is not really acceptable. But I'm not convinced my employer really knew enough. And while I kept waiting for them to change and for them to actually recognize that this was a problem, I need to highlight that it's a problem. And going through the Superstars of STEM program really helped me to find my voice, to find my confidence, because I have this wonderful network of women that I'm able to speak to that can support me in saying, look, this isn't correct. And so I hope that in me raising these issues, that my employer and men and women will step in and change the system.
Beautiful. Yeah, as being from Engineers Australia, obviously this is foremost in your mind, so I'm very interested in what your thoughts are coming from that very dominated male area.
Our industry is very male dominated. I think we're hovering just under 13% women in the profession, and I think that we all do wear the burden, but we also need to stop expecting that women are going to change to fit in. And I think that that's one of the changes that we are starting to see, that some of those cultures are starting to shift, and we're actually starting to see organisations do things like, you know, all flex roles, where we can see flexibility is available for everybody working in a workforce. Doesn't matter whether you're a mother or a father, or you want to take up flexibility for a different reason. And to me, that's a really big cultural change that actually starts to level the playing field for all people that we've got in the workforce.
Beautiful. I must say I've married a civil engineer. There's no such thing as a civil engineer, but that's an old joke. And by the way, honey, if you're on the webinar, 4 o'clock pick up at school, that'd be great. Flexible working hours. He works at a council, so it's all good. Robert.
It's an interesting question of whether there is actually the changes required. I think one of the things I saw last week, Cassidy Sugimoto in America did an analysis of academia. What's rewarded and who does what work. And what she found, that what's rewarded is very much writing the papers, doing the analysis and everything else. But who does most of the laboratory work? Take one guess. It's always the women. They focus very heavily on doing that. They also have the same value set as the men, interestingly, but they still do the work, which fits in a lot with a lot of the other survey work that's been done that says the women will always step in before the ball hits the ground because someone's got to do the work. And perhaps that's where the burden sharing and adjustment needs to be made. Sometimes let it hit the ground and make the men pick up the mess.
Not in my household. I dare to think. Meaghan, as one of our younger panellists, obviously a different generation to mine, not that you would know, clearly. What's your thoughts?
I would just echo what's been said in a number of ways this afternoon, that it really is a shared burden, I think, between the individual and the organisations. Yeah, I probably don't have anything new to add to that point. But
I do come back, and I'm sorry, I've written your name on another piece of paper, but we've still got our younger generation coming through who are saying it's not working and we've not got the systems in place. So, and clearly a very articulate postgraduate student there, echoing, I think, what I thought 30-odd years ago. Did I say 10 years ago? So it really is interesting, how do we look at that system change and what does that look like? So I'm going to come back to that because I'm not giving up on that. But I've always suggested that I'm going to go to the audience next. So I'm looking for hands because I've got another cherub otherwise. No? Oh, yes. Oh, there we go.
Hi there. So my question is about, so we've talked about solution, well, we're talking about solutions, sorry, and you raised the point about is there a requirement to encourage our female STEM participants to be more resilient, or is it the organisations that need to change? I'd pose the question to the panel, 10, 20, many years ago, what would, best case scenario, how could your first employer or your first academic supervisor have encouraged you better, could have prepared you better for your careers as they've gone out now within the STEM workforce?
What a fantastic question. So for the webinar folk, the shortened version is really historically for previous generations, how could have our mentors or supervisors or those really going through our career, how could they have changed it so that we had a better experience? Is that, yeah? I love it. Marguerite, I'm going to go with you because you've got that look and you're in my line of sight.
I think that's a great question, and sort of reflecting on my own career, I think mentoring was key. I wanted a person who would engage with me around my career, not just around sort of boosting my confidence or anything like that. That's an important part of it, but actually help me strategically plan my career, because that's something that was never shared very early in my career, that ability to strategize. Particularly as a kid from a regional area, we experience many of the same things that culturally diverse individuals face. You're leaving your support network, you're leaving, you have no network when you come into a new area, and international students face the same thing. And so unless someone actually takes that time to sit down and have a career conversation with you early in the piece, and where do you want to go? What do you want to do with your career? What are your ambitions? And own that word, because I was ambitious, and don't see that as a negative, see that as a positive. The other important thing that certainly male leaders can do is role model healthy work-life balance. And so that comes back to, I've got to go pick up my kid, as your civil engineer husband has to. I've got to go pick up my kid at 4 o'clock. I want to be at the school concert. I have things on tomorrow. I'll be working from home. I think when men role model those sorts of things, it makes it okay to be doing that in the workplace and fosters that kind of culture, because culture is a whole other conversation we have to have.
Absolutely. Alesha, I'll come back, I'm living engineer bandwagon right now, but so from your personal experience?
I think when I started my career as a young engineer, I just felt that I had to fit in, and that I had to be like all the other people that I worked with, which were mostly men, almost all men, and I didn't have a lot of female role models. So feeling like you could show some of those skills that might have been, traditionally seen as more feminine traits, you just didn't really do that. You just sort of behaved more like the guys, because fitting in was kind of the pathway to success, and I didn't really know any other pathway to success, because I didn't have any other role models that I could see who were succeeding. And I guess what I've learned now is that there are a lot of female engineers out there as well, and that there are a lot of role models. And so if I had have been able to see some of that early in my career, I think that would have been really quite valuable for me.
Karen, I'll go back to you. Clearly not the previous generation, but the one now, but you're a superstar of STEM for a reason. So what are your thoughts on how we can do it differently?
So I think there's been a lot of reflection on the importance of mentorship here, and I certainly have benefited myself from mentors over the years. But I think personally, as someone that suffers from never-ending confidence crises, for me it's really sponsorship. And I think we've not talked enough about sponsorship today, but I was really fortunate in that my PhD supervisor thought I was great, and he told me I was great. And not only did he tell me that I was great, but he told other people that I was good and that I could succeed and that I would do well in my profession. And because my reputation was built from his fantastic reputation, that really helped me, and it helped my confidence, and it helped me when I had the self-doubt and thought, well, I can't sell myself here. What on earth am I doing in this game? My supervisor knew I should be there and told people that I should be there, and that certainly helped me.
So that's a beautiful segue. Yep, Marguerite.
Can I just add to that? Totally agree. But sponsorship requires a reputational risk of the sponsor to sponsor someone. So therefore, they do require to know that person. You work together as a PhD student and a supervisor. So a lot of, certainly in the industry mentoring network in STEM, the program that I oversee, a lot of students will come in wanting a sponsor. That's actually what they're looking for. However, no professional leader will sponsor someone without getting to know them first and knowing their skill set and knowing their capabilities and knowing that they'll follow through and be reliable. And so to me, mentorship is a pathway to sponsorship. And what we're finding is after 1 year of mentoring through the IMNIS program, it's just coming to its first close, is that many will continue to have a relationship and several are sponsoring now actively. And that to me is a win, and it's something I want to track over time, because I do completely agree, particularly for women, but also for culturally diverse individuals, it's really crucial to have a sponsor.
And I've also got something that I'd just like to add on that, and that is how it's really important that senior leaders in industry realise how important sponsorship can be, particularly to women. So, there's a lot of people with a lot of influence who can take on board those people and be their sponsors, but if they don't actually realise how important it is to industry, they might not do it. So it's actually, selling the importance of sponsorship to industry. I think, it's a lot newer in its concept than mentoring or role modelling might be, but it just might be one of those tickets that makes a really big difference to a female in the industry.
Actually, I'm not ending with this because it was one of our webinar questions, was that exact question about mentorship through or sponsorship. And I think it is really interesting that everything that I write is still about that mentorship, but I think we've underestimated truly what that sponsorship model looks like. And I'm keen to just unravel that a little bit to see what from an industry and what from a professional body perspective, how can we go about formalising some of these sponsorship pathways so that it's not about trying to find it yourself, because we've just known that we're not risk takers, females are not risk takers, they're not good at getting themselves out there. So we clearly need a pathway. How do we go about doing that? Robert, I'm going to go with you first, just because I'm that kind of person.
Because you're evil. It's an interesting challenge there, and that going almost back to the first point, the key thing you actually needed to learn when you were young is, okay, you're going into STEM, you're probably an element of an introvert. STEM people by default almost are. The most important thing you learn early on is network is the most important thing. Nearly every senior person I've spoken to has always said, I wish I knew when I was 20 that the network and getting to know people was the most important thing. That's almost your first step towards getting a good mentor, because you actually want someone that you click with. It doesn't help you if you don't click with that person, you can't build that rapport and trust. You will never get to the point where they'll sponsor you. And that has to happen through just meeting lots and lots of different people till you find the ones you click with. And you don't necessarily want them in your own field or anything else, you just want them to advise you what works, what doesn't work, how you engage, how more broadly you get across. And I think that's really what the universities are lacking in, and a lot of the STEM courses are lacking in, is just those networking possibilities, multiple disciplinary activities. The best teams I ever worked with was when I got into CRCs, where we had people from the maths faculty, the engineering faculty and the science faculty all actually just mingling around together, working out what the problems were and sharing knowledge and contacts.
It's interesting you say that, that I'm potentially an introvert. 300 people have just heard that. Can someone sign that you've heard that? But it is interesting that I think in this new age where students are not necessarily going on campus to learn, so they're not sitting around like I might have done in a bar, didn't really do that, Mum, with engineers and IT specialists as a biomedical scientist talking about, and I think I even met a few geologists along the way, but I have a great network of people who are not from my field. I'm just wondering, as the new generation come through and they don't attend lectures in that formal way and they don't hang out at the bar at university, where do those networks come from, and how can we reinvigorate that type? Because I agree, cooperation and networking is essential, and it has to start at university. So how do we go about doing that? Meaghan?
I'll throw out there that throughout my PhD I attended a lot of scientific conferences and also across different disciplines, and I found that enormously helpful. I had an excellent supervisor, a female supervisor, who really pushed me to present at these conferences, which I found immensely daunting when I was a younger student, but has ultimately built up that area of skill so much throughout the course of my PhD, and also forced me to network. You attend the events, and as soon as it hits 5 o'clock and people have a wine and then they want to have a chat, and it's a really great way to meet people across your field and just gain confidence in just chatting to people. So I found that enormously helpful.
I'll go, because I'll do a plug for the industry mentoring network in STEM. We definitely foster networking skills, so that's something we actually get our industry leaders to share their skills directly with PhD students. And often it's actually been a real joy as an executive director to see over the last year quite shy students come into the program initially at that first event, sort of holding their hands, standing in the corner, to being confident networkers, savvy by halfway through, and to they realise after they've been teamed up with a mentor in a very specific way, where we really do ask a lot of questions from both our mentors and mentees to match them very closely, and endeavour to do that, and then offer support throughout the program, which I think helps the relationship progress. But you know, they realise by month 3 who is across the table from them, and go, wow, I have a really influential industry leader here at my disposal, and they get incredibly engaged and excited. And then, you know, they pick up all these skills through the networking events, and they can practice those skills at the networking events. And so, you know, the team is there to support them and cheer them on and encourage them all the way. And I think it's actually been so much more effective than I would ever have thought, just looking at it as a structured mentoring program. So the ripple effects that students have shared have been, you know, I'm much more organised in my personal and professional life. I value the time of others as well as my own time. I'm much more strategic in why I'm doing things, but also that they have hope. And that to me was a really powerful one, because we have a lot of students coming out feeling quite dismal about the future in an academic career. It can be very challenging and highly competitive, as we know, particularly for women. And so to hear them say that they have hope at the end of this for their future, that they have a much broader network, is fantastic.
Can I just
Yep,
add
absolutely.
that was really, for me, one of the great benefits of the Superstars of STEM program, because, I mean, I came over from another country. I am not Australian. I didn't have my network here, and it was really hard to come in to Australia and try and find, it's a big country compared to teeny little Scotland, and so it was really hard to find my people and find people that would support or mentor me. And so part of applying for Superstars of STEM, what was so wonderful about that experience was having this new network. There were 30 women from all different areas of STEM that were selected as part of this program. And you know, in science, you're often in quite a competitive environment, and you're pitted against your peers quite a lot. And I was a bit worried about how this would work in this new network. And actually what I found was this fantastic support group of women that were just out of PhD right the way through to like chief scientist of the Bureau of Meteorology. So it was just learning from these wonderful women from lots of different disciplines, and really helping me to network with others and learn from them. And as I say, that was one of the real fantastic things from this program for me.
So what made you join it originally? Was it that intent that I need to find some sort of mentorship, sponsorship model for yourself?
No, probably more for me. It was partly the frustration of the imbalance of gender in my employment to some extent. It's also just I wanted to increase the visibility of women and women in statistics. So the thing that really inspired me about the Superstars of STEM program was the fact that you were going to do outreach work and go into high schools and chat to them about what you do. And I've really found through that no one has a clue what a biostatistician is. No one has a clue what a statistician is. Usually people don't want to talk to us. And I'm trying to change the perception. I mean, it's a big ask, one biostatistician in the program, but I'm trying to highlight how important it is to understand statistics, whether or not you end up a statistician, but why, you know, maths becomes so scary for people, because, you know, it's a language. It's a language that you might not do for years. If you don't work in science, whatever, you might have finished it in high school, and then suddenly I'm meeting PhD students in nutrition or exercise science, and they're scared of it. They're really, really scared of it. So highlighting that, you know, it's not just in your typical maths thought of jobs where, you know, people just think of mathematicians and that's the job you can do, but highlighting that statistics is sort of underpinning so much of the work we do. I guess I wanted to get that out there.
No, I laugh because statisticians were the first people, when I was doing my exercise science degree, were the first people I went to and made sure they were friends of mine, so I could buy them a beer and say, I don't understand this.
Can I just add something there in terms of the connectivity of professions? I think that given you're here in the building, I get a chance to give a bit of a plug for Engineers Australia, but not just for us, but for industry associations as a whole. We provide a really great opportunity to bring people together and for people to connect. And we do that with industry, academia, and with government. For example, we run over 200 events in here every year. And that's just what we're doing in Victoria, providing opportunities for our members to be networking. And personally, I can say that I've gained so much value from those networks and those connections, and being able to, over the course of my career, know that, if I'm facing this or that, here are the people in my network that might not necessarily be, in my actual area or my industry, but here are some people that I can go and draw their expertise or their mentoring or their coaching to try and help me through my profession on the way. So I think that tapping into associations and being members and actually taking advantage of what is on offer is a really important thing for people to do over the course of their career.
Yeah, really important, and I think I came to that realisation far too late in my career, whereas had it been the norm back at university, you need to join your associations, you need to get your mentoring so that they will come with you on your career journey, because I love that snakes and ladders that Melissa showed. That's completely my career. It hasn't been that straight ladder, it's been all over the place. In fact, it's probably more the downward slope than the upward slope. But it's on the upward slope because I've met this sponsor, so I completely agree with you. I better get back on and stop talking. Another question from the panel, please. From the floor, please.
Hi, my name's Claire. I'm a data scientist at AGL. So my question is about communication. There's been some studies over the last couple of years on gendered language and the differences in language that women and men use, and also the language that appeals to men and women. And it's now progressed to the point that you can run a job ad or an email through some software and get an idea of, are you appealing more to men or women? And I guess my question is, do you think that teaching people how to communicate and how to listen to different communication styles is going to be a key solution to improving diversity in a workforce?
Really interesting question. So the question's about language and males and females identifying with different languages and how we go about using language to make it more inclusive of diversity across the board. And I'd use that as diversity across the board. Perfect question. Who wants to take that one?
This is an interesting question, and I thank you for it, because to me, yes, we do, but ideally leaders, because a lot of leaders come from a different generation where it was okay to use some words. And so to me, what I'm seeing now at scientific conferences or at an event is that, senior level leaders will use different language to junior people. And so that to me is an area of interest, because it's almost as if young people coming through today want to be gender neutral. And so that to me is something I'm still getting comfortable with as a mid-career woman in STEM, because I'm so used to using, some level of gendered language, not quite to the extent that my senior level leaders are, but a gendered language of sort. So I think it's just about encouraging and shifting and understanding and educating. So I completely agree with you. I would actually take it a step further, and a lot of leaders are taught about the psychology of people, right? We all do the Myers-Briggs test, and we all learn about different types, and we're ambiverts, we're introverts, we're extroverts, and on any given day I'll be any one of those. And so I think it's about understanding people better and just getting people to think about that from a very early age, because I think even my daughter, who's 17 in high school, I encourage her to think about the perspective of the people at her school. Where have they come from? What might their experiences be? And so, the local bully might be actually struggling with something at home. You don't know. And so it's about just sort of teaching that broader perspective generally, but I completely agree with you around communication and language.
I also think that language taps into bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And there's some really interesting tests that you can do there. If anyone's heard of the Harvard implicit bias test, it's really interesting to go in there and find how that language links into what bias you might have. it's not just about gender, cultural differences, obesity. There's a whole number of things that are worth looking at and testing your own biases, and that's sort of linked to a language component as well. So I think that links into having a cultural change around how we use language, but also being really conscious that sometimes certain words we are associating with certain gender. And I think one example is possibly, I've seen some studies around this, there was a whole lot of words, but one of them was ambition. That when women are seen to be ambition, when they get labelled with that word, it's not necessarily seen to be in a positive light. But when a man gets labelled with ambition, it's really, really positive. And
which is
why
I
is
use
that?
ambitious every day.
It shouldn't be a negative word for anyone.
Not. Yeah.
Or
Totally
what is
agree.
it, bossy rather than...
You have leadership
Yes.
qualities.
your leadership qualities.
Mm-hmm.
I'm okay for my daughters to be called bossy, and I applaud that. That's fine by me. Can we unpack this cultural bit a little bit more? Because I think it is, again, like the other session, there's an elephant in the room, and it is that cultural piece. Language, I think, is one part of that, but there's other parts to that, you know, if we're really going to have transformative change and have gender parity, we need to, as an Australian society, being part of that global society, find solutions. We're the solutions panel, so I'm going to bring it out there. How do we make the norm gender parity culturally? Meaghan, you're there looking pensive, so I'm going to go with you first.
Thinking very hard about it. I suppose something that comes to mind has already been mentioned about having, you know, diversity and gender balance in those senior ranks. I think I'm fortunate in that where I work at the moment, I see a lot of females in higher levels, and that really helps me see how I could get to that point. I'm going to throw it to someone else now. That's all I've got for now.
Let me go back to that, because I think it is interesting. And coming from CSL, obviously, one of the questions from the webinar was that 60% of graduates in the biomedical biological sciences are female. And yet, I've got to be careful here, but I've worked in other organisations where only 4% of senior leadership are female. So, you know, and it comes back to that scissor effect. So I'm interested that CSL really has taken on the mantra of really working through that. So what is it at CSL? Is it just that mentorship, that see it to be it?
I think that's a big part of it. I think that there's really fabulous opportunities for career development, and I'm starting to experience them. You know, I'm very junior, but I'm already getting feedback from my manager, who is female, about things that I can do to help improve you know, my skills in different areas that previously I don't have experience in. One of them is statistics, so that will be good. So I think CSL is a wonderful workplace for that. I think one of the reasons it is so good is because it's been around for so long and it is such a large organisation. So they have the size to be able to implement a lot of those structures that perhaps smaller organisations aren't able to quite yet.
So it's really interesting, and I'll come back to you, Alesha, from that training perspective, because I mean, we're talking about the ultimate PhD. Once you finish that, you're all done and dusted, but the reality is your career is a continual training paradigm, right? You've got to continue to do courses, particularly in engineering, to keep your accreditation and things like that going on. From Engineers Australia perspective, how do we ensure that females continue through their career to continue the training so that they can get to the next stage, particularly with those career breaks for children?
I really think that the cultural change piece needs to come from the top down. You know, Meaghan, you were talking about how great it is to have a female role model, but it's the female role models keeping those doors open behind them, calling out bias when they've reached those more senior levels, because it's a lot harder to do it when you're just starting out your career. But also there's a really big part in there for male leaders as well. So, you know, the male champions of change in STEM, a group of men being able to, you know, decide how it is to have some influence across the STEM industry and holding each other to account for that. So recognising that, you know, this is not just a women's issue, but it's an issue that we all you know, have the burden of that, so we all have to also be involved in finding those solutions to the problem.
Robert, I'll come back to you as one of our male champions of change on the panel.
I'd step back and almost just ask, what are the assumptions we're making about our actual built work environment? And if you actually step back and unpack it, it's evolved from the fact that it's a very focused, winner-take-all approach, and the whole structure, even this particular edifice that we're in at the moment, is not built to be a community or a family-friendly environment. Where I come from in Canberra, it's really great. I can get to my daughter's school in 10 minutes, so I can go see anything she does there by just stepping out of the office and diving back. I can't do that here in Melbourne. I can't do that. Certainly haven't got a chance in Sydney or New York. There is not the schools, there is not the childcare, there is not the community built around this. This is built as a working edifice. And until you actually get to the concept that this is actually a community edifice, I think we're always going to be running into a underlying limitation built by the assumptions of the built environment that we're working in. And each of us can come up with little things that'll make it a little bit more palatable, but I think we actually have to start stepping back and thinking, what is the overall problem that we're trying to address, and what is the outcome that we wish to achieve, and challenging some of the assumptions we've made.
Fantastic. It's interesting because I spent my postdoc in Copenhagen. I had my first 2 children there, where it is absolutely the norm that the female has the first 6 months off to feed and do all that, and the male has the next 6 months off. Absolutely the norm. So I brought it back to Australia. So husband, you need to go and pick up kids, or if you haven't picked up the kids, they're late. All right.
Can I just add to what you were saying, I guess, because the 4 key issues are around having a career disruption of any sort, and overcoming the compounding effect of that throughout the career, particularly in the academic career, because the minute you fall behind, you're on the slow trajectory all the way through, no matter how hard you try to catch up. Then you've got the metrics by which we measure success in science. We're very focused on publications and grants. We don't consider collaborations and other types of things that a lot of women are engaged in. I was at an organisation that's 75% female at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. It's fantastic. But even our wonderful director, Catherine North, she will admit that her leadership team is only a third women. And so even in a female-dominated organisation, you can have a male-dominated leadership. And so then you come back to culture, which is a huge conversation to have, particularly around organisational culture, be ridding ourselves of the boys' club think, and allowing us to really bring in diversity on decision-making boards and panels and promotion and recruitment committees. That's really crucial. But also, that ability to call out and accepting community and accepting those other practices. But you overlay that beautifully with the whole hyper-competitive system that we have in STEM, and that's something that's incredibly aggressive right now across the board. And with the tight funding situation that everybody feels in academia, the more we can diversify portfolios and diversify the types of research we're doing, I think that will help, and we become more engaged more broadly, particularly with industry, because something that's really crucial is we've introduced new KPIs around industry engagement and impact, and I think that opens the door for a more varied type of scientist to succeed within academia and to have a more mobile career. And that to me is, I think it's a game changer. I think I'd like to see where we are in 5 years' time.
So it's interesting, because that was my next question, really about these career breaks and what programs do we have that are working now? What are the programs that we need to have to really facilitate so that the women can have that career break? They need to have that career break, or we will have no future generation.
And there are more primary carer men as well, and they experience the same slow trajectory if they have it. And the good thing is that we now have parental leave rather than maternity leave at a lot of organisations. There's also, even at ATSI, I have a colleague who's male who will take a lovely 3-month parental break, and I'm cheering him on because I think it's fantastic. And so the more we role model that and accept that and encourage that, the shared responsibility of caring, that promotes women's careers as well as men's career, and it reduces the stigma attached to a man going off to the school concert. So to me, that's a fantastic cultural change that's happening right now. I think it's very exciting. The other thing I just want to say around laboratory science is, because I've been a laboratory scientist for almost 20 years, something that really would have helped me, I've had 5 career disruptions, something that really would have helped is someone in the lab helping out while I was out of the lab, because when you're away, I'm unable to work with mouse models at home. I can't do tissue culture from home, and so therefore I have to be in the lab, and so the minute you leave, it's really tough. And so I'm just applauding every organisation that introduces a research assistant during any kind of leave for men and women, and most women will benefit because they are happening to be the primary carers at the moment. And so that to me is a huge tick in the box right there, led by WeHi. I always acknowledge WeHi, they were the first.
Fantastic.
So.
Alesha, can I come back to the Engineers Australia? So what things, for women who are having career breaks in a male-dominated industry, what things is Engineering Australia doing to try and promote or to try and stop women not coming back?
I guess from an Engineers Australia perspective, we've got some diversity targets for the organisation. So that covers off in terms of staff at all levels, but also through all of our volunteer committees. So there's an expectation that by a target by 2020, we will have 30% women on all of our committees. In some cases, we are actually doing really well. Our board was 50-50. We've just appointed someone else onto the board, so we've just dropped under the 50% now. So being visible about that, so that our position, I guess, is that we can influence what actually happens in broader industry. Whilst we can't, mandate those targets beyond our own walls, we can start to influence what's going on in industry as well. So this year, gender diversity awards were actually introduced so that we could actually recognise some of the organisations that are doing really well in this space and putting them up in lights, and that provides opportunities for organisations to learn from each other. And take those things away and then implement them back in their own organisations, because I don't think it's something that companies should be competing against each other in the space, because I think someone said it earlier, we just end up moving the deck chairs. If we don't actually increase the number of women coming into the profession, we'll just see women moving around, the same women moving around and the same women sitting on those committees. So trying to make sure that we're actually keeping the women in the profession in the first place.
Karen, can I come back to you? So someone who's kind of living the dream potentially of career breaks and things like that, what are you seeing in your area that potentially is helping, or what would you like to see that would help you?
Well, again, from the sort of Superstars of STEM perspective, it's all about the visibility. That's what we've been trying to promote, the visible women working in STEM and being mothers and being pregnant and still being able to go out there and do their work during that process. In fact, we've had a number of superstar babies over the course of this year, which has been fantastic, because I guess there's this perception too that when you're pregnant, you're fragile and you can't go out and do this job and you can't come up and stand and talk to people and do your seminars and whatnot. And these women are doing it right up to the final day. And it's just, showing that this is just another part of life, and this is something that we should be embracing as part of working life, is that people are also having families. And that's what we're trying to show through that.
I love a superstar baby. My two don't listen to that. You're not claimed as that. So it's interesting. Can I come back to that? Because it was something about this language and cultural thing that we had earlier. One of the organisations that I worked for had a resume that needed to be gender neutral. So I couldn't say, look, I've had 5 career breaks, because generally in Australia that would name me as female. But I'm actually quite proud of my 5 children and what I've been able to achieve with my career breaks. Of course, men who came through with me have been able to achieve more, but so be it. I've got 5 beautiful children at any given time. So, what do we do? Do we call it loud and proud? We are female, we've had babies, we've had career breaks, and we've still been successful? Or do we go with the gender neutral so that there is no unconscious or conscious bias?
Fascinating topic. And this is where I'm torn. So with the language of wanting to be gender neutral, and yet clearly there's a bias against women, and so how do we overcome that? And so it is part of, I think, the education piece where we just, need to become more accepting. We need to do our unconscious bias training. We need to have women on decision-making boards. I love in my role as CEO of Women in STEM Australia that I've had the privilege to engage not only with the superstars of STEM as a partner, but also through SAGE, the Science in Australia Gender Equity Forum, as well as APEC Women in STEM. And these are the very conversations they're having as well around that type of how far do we bend the conversation and the language and things. And I think it's crucial, particularly in our cultural context, because Australia's in a different place to somewhere like, Indonesia or somewhere like that. And so that to me is a very fascinating thing. And SAGE can provide the framework for those kinds of conversations. They're bold conversations to have within an organisation, and it allows that conversation to be had. And that to me at least opens the door. I feel like we're pushing at open doors now. When you raise this within an organisation, it is easier for women to have these conversations and to call these things out and say, well, actually, I want to say I've got 5 career disruptions, and actually I don't, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I think that the end game would be one where it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
where it doesn't matter whether you've had children or not, whether you've taken a career break,
Exactly.
and that it's not seen as being a penalty, and it doesn't matter if your resume clearly shows that you've taken a break, because nobody's discriminating against anyone for career breaks.
All right, another question from the floor.
Thank you. Keith Joshi from BRE. We've heard a lot of good ideas this afternoon and a lot of solutions, and I guess we talked a little bit about leaders and grey-haired old guys and what we should be doing as champions of change, which is great. But I wonder if we're to get sort of mass cultural change, where young men are in this story, and whether you're seeing some change, and I think you mentioned some implication of change earlier, and maybe we should be focusing more on young men and how we educate them.
Great point.
Can I feel like I'm doing a lot of the talking, sorry. I think that's spot on, and what's wonderful, and you may be able to speak to this, the Male Champions of Change program is very much about fostering mid-career men through their organisations, and that's part of their remit, is to go back into your organisation and find your male champions of change that can come through the system, because there's nothing worse than having that one champion at the top, they leave and it all goes back to the way it was. That's the pits, and so we really do hold them to account. Certainly Women in STEM Australia asks those questions. What are you doing as a male champion of change to foster that through your organisation? And I'm confident that the Male Champions of Change folks measure that as they go through. You can potentially speak to that.
That's an interesting one to try and speak to it all.
Yeah.
The younger generation is always has it a lot tougher because of the fact that they've got the expectations of the older generation and their own hyper-competitive environment that they're working in as well. So it's actually in some ways much easier for the older generation to say, okay, I've survived, I can now try and make some changes. And one of the interesting conversations that I was taught to have by one of my mentors was with any male who's going, yeah, but the system's okay, is to actually ask them that really difficult question of how well do you think you would have got to your position if you weren't male? And then you try and get that conversation to flow further on down to actually try and increase the self-awareness of people more than anything else, and I think that's the critical element.
I actually had a PhD student who once said, so I've got an 18% success rate based on the current figures at professor level, as a lot of us know, while men have, an 85+% success rate. It's just, when you compare the success rate, in that way and flip it, it's actually really confronting.
So I'm over here. I'm going to bring it back just a little bit. So if I look at what we can potentially do, and I really take this point quite keenly. I've got 3 boys and 2 girls, and I want my boys to be champions of change, which is why I brought one here today. He's playing truant from school. I did sign you out, by the way. These are things I do, by the way, during my daily life. I go, oh, I forgot the child. Remember, I've got to tell him something. So what do we need to do to ensure not just our gentlemen as they come through careers, but what do we do at that junior level to make it seem like, to make it real that gender parity is the norm? So I'm going to go to Karen and then to Meaghan, because you are in that younger generation. What are your perceptions, and what would you like to see, or what have you seen that could really take this and change the culture?
Certainly one of the challenges that I had when I was at school, which, I'm not quite the youngest generation, but was not having the female role models, not having the visibility. So certainly when my maths at school, there weren't women teaching. Same with physics. And so these subjects, you didn't feel that it was for you, and no one made it feel like it was for you. And so it was a strange thing. Well, I mean, I didn't even want to go into mathematics. It was someone telling me towards the end of high school that I was good at it that made me go and do it. It wasn't me seeing, oh, there are these wonderful women doing this. Maybe I should go and consider that myself. So I hope that is changing in schools. I have to say I'm not so up on what the Australian environment is like in high schools and whatnot. But certainly not seeing people doing the same subject as me has been a bit of a challenge, really.
Interesting. Meaghan, so from your perspective?
So I suppose I've got a slightly skewed view as I went to a girls' school, but I suppose that worked in my favour because everyone else in my class in physics was a girl and we were all doing well. So I found that enormously helpful. I suppose what I noticed moving into a university environment, particularly during my honours year, the men in my cohort just seemed to have this innate confidence, and just that they could absolutely dominate it. That it would come to presentations and they would present their research with such gusto. And I found that quite interesting because it wasn't that anyone's research project was any better than anyone else's, but they just had this innate belief in their ability. And I think empowering girls to really feel like they're exactly the same. They're doing similar research, it's just as good, and having that confidence to present in the same way as the men. So I think that would help.
And Alesha, I'll come back to you. I mean, you would see the whole gamut, I guess, from at least when they graduate from engineering school. What have you...
I think that the expectations of the younger generation are actually quite different. So things like access to flexibility, the younger generation might not have kids yet, but they don't necessarily want to work a 70-hour week like an older man who might have had the benefit of a stay-at-home wife who looked after all of that stuff so that the man could actually do 70 hours a week. Like that's actually a huge benefit to any man that's had a stay-at-home wife. A lot of the younger generation, they're not going to get that. I don't think they necessarily expect it. And they want flexibility for different reasons. They want flexibility because they don't just want to spend all their time working. Society's changing. They want to do things outside of work as well. So to me, that's a really big cultural shift, and that is a shift that we should actually be supporting and that leaders should be supporting, rather than trying to pigeonhole those people into an older-fashioned way of work. This is actually part of the solution for supporting diversity, is to encourage and embrace the fact that the young generation also wants to see flexibility and they don't necessarily see things the way that we do, and their expectations are different. So let's nurture that and make that part of the cultural change.
That's actually something that mentors and mentees can do for each other. And so mentees often say to me, why is this industry leader mentoring me? I'm just a PhD student. And yet mentors immediately come back and say, because you're teaching me what today's workforce looks for. You're teaching me what kind of culture I need to develop in my organization. And that to me has been a powerful ripple effect. You know, we have so many partnerships in place for a long period of time, and they really have that ability to communicate to leaders, this is what we actually want. And they won't stand for it. That's what's beautiful, is they will just get up and go if they don't see it in place and go to the next place. So that's what I like.
Beautiful. Okay, yep, up there, Kirsten, thank you.
Hi, I've got a bit of a random question. My name's Heather, I work at Deloitte and I manage the grad recruitment team there. And I'm a bit concerned about our pipeline for females in STEM. Traditionally, we've done really well. We've had 50-50. I've just come back from maternity leave myself and understand there are quite a few changes in terms of immigration. And a lot of our females who have come from, you know, STEM degrees are international students. And I understand it's going to be a lot harder to hire them in graduate roles and harder to be able to sponsor them. So I'm just wondering if other organisations are seeing that, have information for me, you know, some solutions around that to the solutions panel?
Great question. So the question for the webinar crowd was really about a lot of our female PhD graduates are from international countries outside of Australia, and so that's impacting on this ability to do the 50-50 gender equity postgraduate. So what are other industries doing to try and ensure that we find a way around that? Alesha, I'm going to have to go with you.
I'm not sure I've got the exact answer, but definitely in engineering, I think it was you that mentioned it, Regina, earlier, about engineering relying on more overseas qualified engineers than we're actually seeing come through the universities. So it's definitely a problem that is being faced across multiple industries. It's not helped, I guess, coinciding with an infrastructure boom in Victoria at the moment. I'm not sure whether that's also something that is impacting, where people might be getting drawn into different areas because there is just a lot of work going on at the moment. But there's also there's probably opportunities to better tap into some of the skills along the way. So I think that it's challenging for people coming from overseas to get their first job here in Australia, and how do we transition them more quickly to employment so that we can engage their talents sooner rather than later. And again, that comes back to challenging some of the bias that we're carrying, but also sometimes taking a chance on some of these people. You know, they might not tick every single box that we might want, because their cultural experience might be different to what the way that we train up our people. You know, I think typically in Australia we tend to, this might be an engineering specific thing, but we tend to go for more well-rounded, and that's what we like to see in our engineers. But that's not the experience that all engineers have overseas, where some of them will be far more detailed focus. That's actually a part of the diversity piece, and understanding that actually brings great value to the profession by being able to merge those different skills into an organisation. But yeah, sometimes it does mean taking a chance.
I think it's a real conversation we actually have to have as a country, because most universities actively recruit international students. They will say that's the bulk of their income. You know, we export education. And so if we're exporting education and then not employing these people in any kind of way, I think we're missing out on a great deal of talent. Even programs that are funded by the government are largely only available to Australian citizens or permanent residents, and that to me is something for IMNIS. Largely, a lot of our students are international students, and they benefit so much from having an industry leader. And the industry leader benefits, as I was just expressing, that they learn a great deal about people. And so to me, it's something as a country, we need to have this conversation around some of the policies we have in place. And I would love to see that conversation happen. I think APR.Intern has a small degree of international internships for international students, but they're not available to all. Same with Superstars of STEM, it's limited to Australian citizens and permanent residents. So I think the more we can open up some of the programs we're offering, the better our skill set will come through. Completely agree with what you said around we look for a well-rounded employee, and I recently have had the experience of applying for a leadership program where I had to do the 2-minute YouTube video, and it wasn't explained to me at all why I had to do the 2-minute YouTube video, but it's already put me off, and I'm a pretty confident communicator. I hate to think of how many other people it's put off, particularly potentially quiet people or shy people. And so that, to me, again, adds a bias into it in terms of our recruitment processes. So I think that's something for organisations to look at as well.
Thanks, Marguerite. I'm just conscious of the time, and I do want to wrap this session up. So for those of you in the audience who've probably been taking better notes than me, feel free to share online. But I've got here that mentoring is essential, but sponsorship is probably, if not more important than mentorship, so please bring that into your organisations. Networking of interdisciplinary codes, whether that be at university, in your workplace, again is really important, because we're all talking about innovation and collaboration. Continual training programs targeting females is particularly important as well, and how you go about doing that. Compounding leave is important to understand, and we need to have work support while that person is on leave for another bout or a second or third bout of leave. And I love the idea of the Gender Diversity Awards, where we actually applaud those organisations who stand up and say, we are for gender parity, and I think the more people who do that, the better. I hope I haven't forgotten anything terribly big. If you have, then feel free to online me, because people do that all the time. Couple of take-home messages from our key speakers today, and I think they were amazing. From Catherine, don't be scared to tell employers your aspirations. We as females need to do that more and more, and go home and tell everyone that you know to go and do that. And also don't be scared to tell your employers what you can't do, because we do need to have a work-life balance if we're really going to have that gender parity. And that's both for males and females. I love her last point, and that is be risk-taking and accept failure. Failure is not a bad thing, and we need to tell our new generation that failure actually you can learn from, and learn profound things. From Alesha, I love your game of snakes and ladders, and that truly, for young generations, if you want a career in STEM, that's your career. But it's fun. You never know what it's going to bring. You never know where you're going to head. And if you're prepared to have a game and take a ride, I guarantee you, and I'm pretty sure everyone sitting up here will tell you, it's a pretty damn good ride. And the other one is know what you want to do when you get out of bed. I love that. So thank you all. Thank you for your intention. Thank you for your enthusiasm. And just before I head back to Jeff, I'm going to leave you with a quote that I spoke of last week, and I've had a lot of people talk to me about it. And it's a quote from our first female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. Julia Gillard finished the book pondering this thought. The perceived image and sight was the king, and if the woman ended up with authority, she was either being made a Madonna figure or a she-wolf, a self-seeking, hard-grasping, immoral woman. But it's a myth that wolves howl at the moon. In truth, when they howl, they're calling to their pack. I leave you with that. Jeff, yours.